today's election will have implications not only for the United States, but also for people around the world. The purpose of this panel discussion this evening is to talk about the implications of the outcome of the election for Europe. And with us today are two distinguished individuals. First is Paul Taylor, who is a contributing editor for Politico, and he's also a senior fellow at the Friends of Europe. The second is Dr. Jamie Shea. He was formerly the Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO and is a professor at Exeter University in the United Kingdom. I'll be serving as the moderator of today's event. My name is Jerome Sheridan. I'm the director of American University of Washington, D.C.'s Brussels Center, and I'm a professor of international relations. So to get underway, let's put the election in the broader outcome of the direction of policy. Jamie, what do you think are going to be the most important foreign policy and national security challenges facing both Europe and America in the next 4 years?
Well, Jerry, first of all, thank you very much for welcoming me to this podcast, webcast, whatever we're going to call it. But for me, the most important challenge, number one, is more transatlantic cooperation in handling COVID, which is affecting the United States and Europe probably more harshly than anywhere else in the world at the moment. As you know, Jerry, we didn't get off to a good start with the US not joining the EU's COVAX vaccination scheme, and President Trump initially banning EU citizens from traveling to the United States. But if both our economies are wrecked by COVID and we see China recovering from the virus quickly and growing now by 5 or 6% globally, we are both going to be a severe economic disadvantage. And therefore, I think we have an interest in trying to help each other, both to overcome this dreadful virus as quickly as possible, for example, by cooperating on vaccine distribution, on dealing with future pandemics, on dealing with greater assistance in protective equipment, those kind of things, and in coordinating our economic policies as much as possible so that we can help each other to recover, and therefore obviously being in a better position to face the post-COVID world when hopefully one day it eventually arrives. I think the second thing is, of course, to take a common transatlantic approach to China. One of the legacies of the Trump administration is that Trump has put China much more on the European agenda as a challenge, as a competitor, and not only as a partner. We see this in the number of European countries, for example, that have heeded the call of the United States to disinvest from Huawei 5G technology. But it strikes me that if we have this common approach to China, we're going to be much more successful at containing the Chinese challenge in a way that does not produce a conflict. For example, the US is about 25% of global GDP, but if you add on the EU countries and other partner countries around the globe of the United States, it comes to about 65% of global GDP. So together, obviously, we're going to be in a much better position to influence China's behavior in a more positive way. And finally, to rebuild the multilateral order, which has served both our interests so well over the last 70 years since World War II. It suffered a lot over the last few years, and it's badly in need of repair, particularly if we're going to jointly confront the rise of the authoritarians. We need to repair that multilateral order in the nuclear domain, with more nuclear arms control to prevent more nuclear proliferation. We need to reform, of course, the World Trade Organization and the basic trading rules. We need to deal together with the climate change challenge, and also the regulation of these new technologies in the cyber area, artificial intelligence, in the social media domain, the fake news, which have posed such a big challenge to the vitality of our democracies. So these are big issues, and a lot of issues sort of come under these individual umbrellas. But to my mind, helping each other to recover from COVID, a common approach to China, and rebuilding the multilateral order are where we really should be seeking to work together better over the next 4 years than, regrettably, we've managed to do over the last 4.
Thank you, Jamie, for that comprehensive overview. Paul, what's your take on these issues? What are the most important challenges facing Europe and America?
Well, particularly if you're looking at the European Union, Jerry, I would say that the recovery, ensuring the recovery, the economic and social and health recovery from COVID is absolutely central. You know, Europe has been hit by the greatest economic depression since before World War II. And this only just over a decade after the last Great Recession. And so it's a huge challenge. It threatens potentially the stability of European societies, the relationship between generations and all of that stuff. And that is, in a way, a national security challenge for all of us. It's a challenge that we're going to share with the United States, even though, as Jamie said, with the Trump administration, the United States has either been absent in international leadership or gone its own rather contrarian and hostile way during this crisis. More broadly, I mean, apart from that, Europe has a huge interest in trying to stabilize its neighborhood in the coming 4 years, and whether it will get more help and support from the United States in doing so or less, or destabilization potentially coming from the United States is one of the things that I think is at stake in today's election. Whoever wins, Europe needs to take more responsibility for its own neighborhood, from the Western Balkans to Central and Eastern Europe, to that arc of crisis around the Mediterranean, Syria, Turkey, Syria, Israel, Palestine, Libya. You know, lots of dry tinder, lots of unresolved conflicts there. And the United States, clearly, with its focus having shifted increasingly to dealing with China, is going to have less bandwidth for that. The Europeans have not done tremendously well in stabilizing their neighborhood. They lack the hard power tools or the will to use them. And their soft power only reaches so far, because they're no longer really offering to open their doors and admit new members in the way that they did a decade or two ago. So while the United States' top priority, I would say, post-COVID, apart from the COVID recovery itself, will be managing the rise of China and trying to do so, one would hope, peacefully. I think what we have in common also, and this more probably if we have a Biden administration and if we have a second Trump administration, ironically, although the Republicans have always been the party of free trade and an open global economy, is preserving an open global economy. Last thought, you know, the founding Secretary General of NATO, Lord Ismay, said that NATO was created to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out. I think the challenge over the next 4 years maybe is going to be to keep the Americans in to some extent, Russia out still, and China honest.
Very good, very good. I like that observation. Let me pick this up and take it one step further in talking about the actual outcome of the election. And early in his administration, President Trump labeled the European Union a foe, and he's openly questioned the value of NATO. I'm curious, what impact do you think the last 4 years have had on the transatlantic relationship? And if Trump is reelected, what can we expect over the next 4 years? Go ahead, Paul.
Well, I think the last 4 years have been hugely detrimental. But I guess they have proved that the transatlantic relationship at its core remains a resilient one. There's so much at stake. It's the world's biggest bilateral economic relationship. It's the biggest mutual investment relationship. There's a huge amount that is there. And of course, in the United States, there's a bedrock of support for NATO and for a strong transatlantic relationship in the Congress, in the foreign policy establishment, in the military. And that has been one of the checks and balances that I remember being at a NATO summit, covering a NATO summit in June 2018, when President Trump was railing against Germany and suggesting, you know, that the United States might just go off and do its own thing. Congress sent over 2 senior senators, one from each of the parties, after passing a resolution by, I think, 98-2, expressing support for NATO. So clearly, you know, it's been detrimental in the following ways. Trump and the Trump administration have actively fomented division and weakening of the European Union by supporting Brexit, by encouraging and rolling out the red carpet in Washington for leaders from Poland and from Hungary who are openly defying the European Union's values and principles on the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary, media freedom, and so on, in identifying, singling out Germany as for a sort of particular excoriation almost daily, and resenting the Mercedes on Fifth Avenue as if they were somehow foreign invading tanks, even though many of them are manufactured, I believe, in the United States by American workers, and by using national security as a pretext to impose tariffs on steel and aluminium produced by European allies. The United States has threatened the European Union repeatedly over trade, taxation, antitrust policy, and with secondary sanctions on European firms that defied American national sanctions on Iran, for example, in breach of an agreement which the United States itself had subscribed to under the previous president. So a lot of damage has been done, a lot of confidence has been lost, but I think, unfortunately, it has not led the European Union to behave more as a coherent actor. I think that Trump's divisive tactics have been quite effective, but what you've seen in Europe, to some extent, is hedging by some countries which have decided it's better to have a strong bilateral relationship with the United States, because you don't really know if you're going to be able to go on trusting NATO or the European Union to protect you if push comes to shove. And so in that sense, I don't think that Europe has been made more coherent. Perhaps it's been resilient. It's true that in the light of Brexit, in the aftermath of Britain's vote to leave the Union, some people thought the European Union might break up. Trump himself was regularly asking people in that first year, so who's going to be next to leave? So how's this going to unravel? That didn't happen. The European Union has held together, and it's held together also relatively firmly in a single negotiating position with the UK. But that whole kind of attempt to use the UK and to use countries like Poland and Hungary as a crowbar to open up and to undo the European Union has been very destabilizing. And one can only hope, from a European perspective, that the outcome of today's election will bring that to an end and open a new chapter.
Jamie, what's your take? What would a Trump re-election do for the future of the EU and NATO relationship?
Well, my sense is that if you ask Trump, have you been good or bad for NATO, he'd probably be really shocked to hear that question. And he would say, look, I've been great for NATO. I've roughed those guys up a bit, but I've got them to keep to their commitment to spend more on defense, more than my predecessors were ever able to. On the campaign trail, Trump has been making a big play out of the fact that since he came to power, the Europeans are spending about $130 billion more on their defense, and more of them are meeting that 2% of GDP target, which is a NATO commitment, not an American imposition. Trump would also point to the fact that he sent extra American forces to Poland. He sent a lot of American forces over on exercises. For that reason, of course, he's quite popular in the eastern part of NATO, if not always in the western part. I think here you have to distinguish between Trump and the Trump administration. If you look at the Trump administration, you could probably point to quite a few positive things vis-a-vis NATO and even Europe. For example, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, always praises NATO as the one international organization that he and the Republicans really do like, as opposed to the WTO or the EU or many others. And if you again look at the State Department and American diplomacy, recently they've been engaged on seeking a resolution of the problems between Greece and Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean. intervening also with the EU to sanction Belarus. They've been active as part of the Minsk group to find a solution in Nagorno-Karabakh, and they've even tried to do some troubleshooting between Kosovo and Serbia. And I've written articles praising the fact that American diplomacy is back in terms of crisis management in Europe. So the Trump administration probably is slightly different from Trump. Trump himself, of course, unlike members of his administration, has questioned the NATO security guarantee. And according to the New York Times, Trump in private meetings has said that he would like to pull out of NATO. So I suppose really for Europeans, if Trump is re-elected, the question is do we get Trump or do we get the Trump administration or do they become one of the same thing maybe in a way that they haven't been over the last 4 years? That said, and I take what Paul has said, I think that the Europeans are sort of between a rock and a hard place. If Trump is re-elected, people like President Macron of France will continue to make the case that given that we can no longer depend on the United States in the way that we used to, Europe has to push ahead with its own strategic autonomy. Paul outlined that, and that will upset the Trump administration. On the other hand, if Joe Biden wins, it's a little bit the opposite, that many Europeans will think, oh my God, we don't need to do this any longer. You know, we're back to the good old days when we had a totally reliable United States. And so, you know, all of this effort to spend more on defense or to stand on their own 2 feet, we don't need that. We know we can take our foot off the gas pedal because Washington will pull our chestnuts out of the fire. I think that would be a serious mistake because if Joe Biden wins, the tone will be better in the transatlantic relationship. But Biden's not going to put 400,000 American troops back in Europe that were there during the Cold War. There will be differences. So I think whoever wins the election, Europe is going to have to push ahead with its strategic autonomy. And if it's by either Trump or Biden, find a way to sell this in Washington as something which is in the long-term American interest to have a better, more capable European partner, even if it means a Europe that can talk truth to power in Washington and can express its own opinion, and maybe isn't always going to buy American military equipment to please the administration. So I think the challenge for Europe in terms of how it deals with power, how it defines its own strategic interests, but in a way that keeps the transatlantic relationship going. That's been a permanent problem for Europe for many years. And I think either Trump or Biden, it's going to continue to be the main challenge.
Very good. If I can push you on that for just a couple more minutes. In addition to what you've just said, what do you think will remain the same in the relationship between the United States, NATO, and the European Union, and what will change if Biden wins the election?
Well, obviously the tone will be different, as I've said already. I mean, Biden has suggested he'd come over for an early NATO summit. There would no longer be talk of leaving the alliance. Biden will be a multilateralist. And I think one of the good things for NATO will be that not only will the US remain committed to collective defense, but there are 2 other core tasks of NATO where Trump, frankly, has been less engaged, which is crisis management on the periphery of Europe. Paul referred to the issues in Libya, in North Africa, in the Middle East, the instabilities in Ukraine and Georgia, where clearly NATO would like to play a stabilizing role. And I would hope that Biden, particularly with his enormous commitment to Ukraine, which has got him into trouble during the campaign with the Trumpites, of course, but we know that Biden is very much committed to the stability of these countries. I think Biden would be more engaged in that part of NATO. And the other part is cooperative security, NATO's attempts to develop partnerships with countries around the globe that are like-minded democracies, and maybe to work on new challenges, which I mentioned earlier, like cyber. So in other words, I think Biden would keep the Trump commitment to one part of NATO, but probably do more in terms of some of those other core tasks. I think in the EU, I mean, I defer to Paul here, who covers these issues closer than I do, but Biden, I think, would recognize the EU more and its value, the essential role it plays in preserving democracy and prosperity in Europe. And probably he'll go back to having those periodic EU-US summits that Trump has not held at all. But on many of the trade issues, life will be tough. I mean, Biden is committed to a foreign policy that benefits the American middle class, to social programs. He's not going to want to be rolled over on what he would consider to be unfair trade any more than Trump has been. He's going to take a hard line on China. So the dilemma for the EU on how to deal with China without becoming equidistant between the United States and Beijing, I think that will continue. I don't think that we're going to go back to TTIP, this idea of a big comprehensive EU-US trade deal, which Biden advocated when he was vice president, but I think the time for that has passed. There's just too much protectionism on both sides of the Atlantic. So again, I think the tone would be better, there would be more engagement, easier to pick up the phone, easier to talk to people. Not so much the difference between the Trump and the Trump administration and the Biden and Biden administration. But let's face it, Jerry, historically, there's never been a perfect administration for the Europeans, and vice versa. Whoever has been in the White House, we've had our successes and failures, our agreements and disagreements. It's always been a turbulent affair, and I would imagine that although it would be easier to handle some of those very intractable issues on data privacy and taxation of the social media giants and all of those kind of things would rumble on as well. So we've got to be prepared to negotiate on the basis of hard interests.
And Paul, do you have anything to add on what the impact of the Biden administration on the relationship?
Jamie's answered for me as well as himself, of course. And so this not being a presidential debate, you didn't turn off his microphone. But I think the crucial thing is that Biden will treat the European Union as a central partner and interlocutor in Europe and in the world, one of America's great allies, along with NATO, and that will make a very big difference. And lots of things will flow from that. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit waiting to be picked. The return to the Paris Climate Agreement and US-European cooperation that could lead internationally in fighting climate change and driving the transition to cleaner carbon-neutral energy. Lifting the US blockade on the World Trade Organization and getting that back up and running again. Reversing the withdrawal from the World Health Organization and working cooperatively, as Jamie referred to before, on health, on vaccines, on the aftermath of COVID, on preparing for the next pandemics, which will inevitably arise. Rejoining the Iran nuclear deal. That won't solve all of the problems, but it will be at least America going back to being a country that respects its own signature on international agreements. I also think the dynamics within Europe will be beneficial. That President Biden would be closer to the mainstream in Europe, to Germany, France, Italy, more critical of outliers in Europe that have challenged human rights, the rule of law, and so on. There will no longer be a bonus, a red carpet in the White House awaiting anybody who defies Brussels, especially when it's on human rights or our liberal values. And I think that also applies within European politics in each of our countries. The national populists around Europe have gained succor from having somebody that they could identify with, and who indeed used US embassies in some countries to openly support them. We saw Nigel Farage, the British national populist who led the campaign to leave the European Union at Trump campaign rallies. So we're going to, it's going to be a big difference. And I think all of those players in Europe will be taken down a peg domestically if they lose their patron in the White House. If Trump were to be seen to be roundly defeated in the United States on a massive turnout, which is one of the possible outcomes today, perhaps it's too early to say a probable outcome today, then I think that will have huge consequences also in European politics. On the contrary, if President Trump, Houdini-like, achieves re-election, then the question is, will he be any different from the last 4 years? And there, Jamie's distinction between the Trump administration and President Trump himself, it works up to a point. I think when John Bolton was his national security advisor, the desire to actively to break up the European Union was really quite strong. There was an ideological opposition to any idea of pooling sovereignty. Any idea of supranational governance was totally anathema to those people. I don't know what a second Trump administration would be. George W. Bush took some unilateral actions and decisions in his first term that made him an unpopular president in Europe for a time. Notably, but not only the war in Iraq, but also he pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol, again, on climate change. So, and he also imposed some tariffs on European steel, if I remember rightly. So, there's a sense of deja vu all over again. The difference is he had much more of the foreign policy establishment with him in the United States, and his second term was much more multilateral. I'm not convinced we would see that in a second Trump term. I think President Trump would feel that he had beaten the entire system. He'd beaten the entire establishment, the deep state. He'd ground them into dust. He'd killed every pollster in the country. And now he was going to have it his way. And so I think that the concern is that Trump, too, would be Trump amplified.
Thank you, Paul. One last question. It may, because of the unprecedented number of mail-in ballots, it may be days or even weeks before we know the outcome of the election. And there has been word in the press that perhaps this could lead to civil unrest in the United States. My question is, from the European perspective, how likely do you see this to be the case? And if that happens, if there's civil unrest in America over the next few weeks, what would happen to America's reputation in Europe?
Europeans are praying for an undisputable, clear outcome, whatever it is. Our media has probably exaggerated the degree of civil unrest and violence and vigilante conflict and so on in the United States. It makes great copy, and it confirms some people's stereotypes of the United States as the ugly side of the United States. But I think the checks and balances have been strained under the Trump era, and everybody, I think, in Europe is crossing their fingers that this climate of extreme partisanship, which has rubbed off to a degree in Europe, was already there in some countries, but has rubbed off particularly in the UK, perhaps in Poland, and in Italy. This US, the degree of civil strife that there is in the United States has already harmed the US's standing internationally, I think, as a moral, political authority on human rights, on the rule of law, on equality among races. But I think that a really contested election with the apparent loser refusing to accept defeat and fighting it would be tremendously harmful to the United States and to the West as a whole.
Jamie?
I agree with Paul. The best result for anybody in a democracy is a clear and decisive majority. clear winner, clear loser, for all of the reasons that Paul suggested. It makes it harder to sort of push all of this stuff through the courts and to go to lawfare, to litigate things which should be decided through politics. I think also it will have the added benefit of forcing the Republican Party, which unfortunately in recent years has become more and more a sort of sectarian right-wing American nationalist party, turning its back on the former tradition of tolerance, liberalism, open trade, international security that the Republicans stood for. And I think it's not good for the future of US democracy if there is one truly national democratic party with a small d, and then another sort of a party which is turning its back on democracy and sees its role only to maintain itself in power at any cost whatsoever. That's not good in the long run, and a decisive victory, I think, for the Democrats, because we're not just looking at Joe Biden here. Of course, we're looking at the control of the Senate. Of course, that's very important. The Congress, does that tip towards Democratic control? What goes on at the state level and so on. But a decisive Democratic victory, I think, would be the thing that would trigger that revival of a true Republican Party, which the Lincoln Project, those Republican dissenters from Trump, have been calling for. On the other hand, let's be realistic. Trump's approval rating is 45%. So we know that well over 40% of the American electorate, that's several tens of millions of people, are very loyal Trumpites, and they're not going to abandon him or abandon the cause simply because they lose. As Paul pointed out, the polarization of American politics goes back to many, many years. It's a long time since a Democrat crossed the aisle to vote for a Republican bill or vice versa. And I think Joe Biden, even with a very large majority, if that were the case, would have to fight long and hard to be able to form the new sort of bipartisanship, which would be needed to introduce the important reforms on tax, on infrastructure, on policing, and so on, that the United States would need. I think with Biden, you would have more of an attempt to reach out across the aisle, because he did that for several years as a senator. But the healing process will take a long time. But at least, I have to nail my colours to the mast here. With a Biden victory, that healing process can begin. Every long road starts with a first step, which I do not believe would be the case with a Trump victory, where the polarization would continue. The interesting thing, of course, would be the relationship between Congress controlled by the Democrats and the Supreme Court, which now has a 6-3 heavily slated conservative Republican majority. And I do not believe that it's healthy for any democracy. The important questions like affordable health care, the future of abortion, voting, suppression, gun control, that these things which should be decided by the Congress, which should be the first pillar of power, is increasingly being settled by judges in the courts. But as I said, a clear Biden victory at least means that this healing can start. In the case of a Trump victory, it would be postponed by at least another 4 years. But those deep rifts in the United States are going to take a long time to heal, let alone the Black Lives Matter movement and all of the other issues which have been percolating for a long time.
Jamie Shea and Paul Taylor, thank you very much for your excellent insight at this critical moment in America's history and global history. Thank you again. Good night.